You're listening to Outside the Box with Ben Cominos here on WHBY and the Political Voices Network. Outside the Box is brought to you by Roush Plumbing and Remodeling, the plumbing and remodeling company the Fox Valley depends on. Yeah, I'll admit I've done an embarrassingly little amount of coverage on this flock camera conversation in the state of Wisconsin that I'm going to work this evening to rectify for tomorrow's show. If you weren't listening to the local half hour with Jonathan Ritchie and I, um, there's a lot of consternation and questions circulating the use of these flock cameras, regulation, the way that police officers and other agencies are using them. I have people texting me about during that conversation. I'm not going to say which police departments, just because I would have to corroborate this story for myself. But there is a cop in Milwaukee that's using these flock cameras essentially to track one license plate specifically, and this is kind of the surveillance state thing that so many people warn about when they talk about the integration of AI and data centers and these cameras everywhere. And this isn't a new take, mind you. It's just that it's more pervasive than it has ever been, and it is actually being utilized in a way that, in my opinion, is a bit more flagrant than the way that it has been operating for the last 20 years. I'm old enough to remember when people used to question back when you still needed an edu email address to use Facebook. I remember the professors in the older generation when we were all getting on Facebook saying, um, "Oh, you really going to catalog your entire life and just put it up there on the internet? Are you really going to do all of this X, Y, and Z?" We didn't think anything of it. Now people have these doorbell cameras. Hell, the Alexas are spying on you. You know what I mean? Like it's all over the place now. You can't get away from it, and you can tell where it all started and where we ended up. And Kathy, I see you saying, "I lead a dull life. I have not been flocked, Ben." Here's the thing, Kathy. I'm old enough to remember when they said, "Oh, the Patriot Act is to monitor terrorism. As long as you're not committing any crimes or doing any terrorism, you don't need to worry about it." And then it turns out that terrorists can be identified as anybody who happens to say that our orange dad president doesn't have any idea what he's doing in Iran. Now that brings my thoughts into question, and it's funny how loosely we can move that kind of definition around. So that's kind of where I get nervous about this kind of conversation, is that it's always people saying, just don't do anything wrong and you don't have to worry about it. It seems to me that this person who was being allegedly monitored by the Milwaukee police officer there wasn't doing anything wrong. They were getting stalked. And that's a problem. That's a problem with these kind of things here. And this is what happens when you have an unregulated surveillance state that they set up for your protection, for your security. And Jerry even said during the segment, "Come on, Ben, we need to monitor you." And then he puts in quotes, "for your protection." Yeah, exactly. Exactly. One of the first segments I ever did that I think ingratiated me to the people that really don't identify with either party is I highlighted that COVID and 9/11 were basically the same thing in terms of giving up your freedoms, but they impacted different populations of people differently. And depending on which one of these statements makes you more mad, I can tell you which political party that you identify with. But in the mid 2000s, 9/11 happened. We had to do the war on terror, and we gotta take your freedoms in order to make sure that terror doesn't happen again. And everyone in the Republican Party was like, "Take my freedoms, take my freedoms." And leftists were sitting there saying, this could really be weaponized against you in a pretty quick fashion. Flash forward to 2020 during COVID, and the government was saying, "We need to do contact tracing, and we need to monitor where you go, what you're doing, what you're buying, what time of the day you're there, all the time to make sure that we can stop the spread and get on top of this disease." And liberals were saying, "Take my freedoms. Here's where I am all the time. Don't worry about it. Let me know if you need any other information about me." And leftists are sitting there saying, this is probably going to set us up for a world of hurt in the future. There's really only one population of people that seems to know when to call this out, regardless of the excuse that they give you for why they need to monitor you. Um, And if we could just fast forward to the part where we just acknowledge that leftists are right, that would, I think, save us a long time. That would just save us so much time rather than having a conversation in 2037 about like who could have possibly foreseen that that these flock cameras were going to be used in this specific way. I'm telling you right now on March 25th, 2026, exactly how this is going to play out down the line. And I would prefer we just skip over that entirely, if that's okay with you. But that is me going off the cuff. That's as a result of a conversation we had in the last half hour. We'll do a more in-depth conversation about this later. As I mentioned, we have Charles Franklin with Marquette University coming on the program at 9:30 to break down a lot of the findings in the Marquette poll. Normally, he's on Jonathan Krause's show in the afternoons, Your News Now. However, Jonathan is out of commission this week. He's on vacation. So he texted me, asked if I'd like to speak to Charles. I was like, yeah, why not? So we're going to discuss the Marquette polling, but with somebody who actually helps do it and can help interpret the data a little bit. So should be an interesting conversation there. Of course, we also have the professors in the 10 o'clock hour, which means I don't have a whole lot of time. I don't have a whole lot of time with just you guys and little old me to break down what's going on in the world. So we're just going to hit a couple of stories here as quickly as we can en route to those two conversations here. And I want to start, and if you guys haven't been following along, it's a hell of an interesting story of what's happening right now with the special elections that took place in Florida last night. You know, I had a new listener on my YouTube stream who hopped in, who really took offense to a joke that I made about voter fraud. I made a comment about the election in Maine, and I said, and I can't even vote on the election in Maine. So I said, well, technically I can't. We'll see how I feel about it. I might vote a couple of times there in Maine. And this person called me a smug word that I can't say on the air and said, you're joking about something that's so flagrantly corrupt. How do you feel comfortable doing that? Mail-in voting is a bastardized process. You can't use mail-in voting. We have to ban it. We cannot do that anymore. Well, I hate to break it, and I hope that listener in California is still listening, because unfortunately the sitting president of the United States just engaged in voter fraud, having voted for him, the Republican candidate, via mail in the district where Mar-a-Lago is. So Donald Trump apparently committed voter fraud if you are a MAGA person. To everybody else who understands that mail-in voting is not voter fraud and that voter fraud is basically non-existent in this country, go about your business. But to the SAVE Act proponents, to the voter fraud, to the mail-in voting is voter fraud people, Donald Trump just committed voter fraud. And what do you think the penalty should be for committing voter fraud? 920-281-1150, 920-281-1150. It's a crazy time to be alive, is it not? But that's just me, of course. Needless to say, I'm being sarcastic about that. Everybody should be voting by mail. Tom Tiffany has voted by mail a dozen times while trying to tell you that it's fraudulent. Turns out they like to say one thing and then do something polar opposite of that. And maybe one day you guys will wake up to that instead of attacking me. But that probably isn't going to be today. And as KG says, it's okay if Trump does it. Isn't that the truth? I watched the video. If you guys haven't seen the video going viral, they have a woman in a MAGA hat talking about mail-in voting, and then she's, going off, hitting all the MAGA talking points, and then the interviewer says, did you know Trump voted by mail? She's like, did he really? And like you see her immediately trying to process how it was okay for him to do it, but it's not okay for the other people to do it. It's absolutely disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting that people's minds have a capacity to disassociate that way. Trust me, as someone who's trying to bridge gaps and who does not suffer ignorance particularly well, it makes it difficult to do this job the right way from time to time. We'll just say that. But despite Donald Trump's efforts to steal an election via mail-in voting, it did not go the way that he anticipated, and it's actually a pretty mind-blowing statistic. Emily Gregory defeats John Maples in Florida House District 87. It's a special election that took place. The Democrat ends up winning the House District that houses Mar-a-Lago in it. Moreover, in 2024, that was a Trump plus 11 district. This has been a recurring theme since the election in 2024. And while it is not unique for the party that wins the presidency to see a bit of a correction in the midterm year and in the off election years, the extent to which we are seeing one, the quote unquote safe districts that no longer appear to be safe anymore, seem to be growing in number by the day, and needs to be addressed in a way that I'm sure mainstream media is talking about it, but I would like to hit from my own perspective. For the record, there were 3 races, and one of them still did stay Trump. Florida Senate District 51 is a Trump plus 13.5 district. That one stayed Trump. But Senate District 14, which was plus Trump 7.1, and as I mentioned, House District 87, which was plus 11, both flipped Democratic yesterday. And just for some perspective, that makes 28 state seats in states across the country that flipped in favor of Democratic officials. 0 have flipped from Democratic to Republican. Obviously, a handful in both directions have stayed the same. We are a heavily gerrymandered country that probably needs to be addressed in a more meaningful way at some point. Most certainly won't be anytime soon. I hate to be a defeatist. I'm just being honest about it here. But this kind of paints the picture for why I think there's quite a bit of optimism here in Wisconsin, because not only are we dealing with what appears to be a pretty flagrant course correction in terms of the way people were voting from 2024 until today, but on top of that, Wisconsin is in a unique position where we were a heavily gerrymandered Republican state to begin with a much more fair reflection of how these maps are supposed to operate. So when you mix all of these factors in, it makes for a pretty interesting November in Wisconsin and all over the country, and that is inevitably going to be classified as voter fraud. Something that I am not going to take seriously. Like, I'm going to tell you that right now. I'm going to be outright derisive, and I would like to state this on the record now, because when it comes time, I'm not even going to entertain any ideas of voter fraud without evidence of voter fraud. Again, there's people in my emails as we speak. 9% of Democrats believe that the 2024 election was stolen with the help of Elon Musk and Starlink. That's an embarrassing thing to think. The reason the Democrats lost the election in 2024 is they did not take the economy seriously, they did not take the border seriously, and there's an element of the voting population out there that will vote exclusively on 7 transgender athletes and nothing else. You take those 3 components, that's how the Democratic president lost in 2024. Same idea in 2020. Democrats didn't steal the election. Donald Trump is a uniquely bad president. It's taken about 15 months for people to remember that Donald Trump is a uniquely bad president, but here we are again. And we are at a point right now, I have no idea in terms of war with Iran if these peace talks are real. We did an episode on it on Monday about it's a surreal place to be, that I don't know if I can trust the sitting United States president or the leaders of Iran when it comes to the conversation about peace talks, because I really don't have any reason to trust either one of them in regards to this conversation. But even if these peace talks are real, and in the next 2 to 3 weeks, the war in Iran is over, and we wiped out this regime that 70% of people probably couldn't even tell you existed before a month ago. There is no scenario where the cost of living, the cost of gas, the cost of any of this is going to come down. Healthcare premiums are going up. Houses are still unaffordable. There is so much going against this president. If you have not seen the numbers for people under 30, in terms of cost of living, Donald Trump is currently minus 40% in cost of living for people under 30, because the people who voted for him not caring about something trans and not caring about culture war issues, who actually believed that they were left out to dry by the Democratic Party and were hoping for some kind of changing of the guard by voting for Trump, have not only not seen these things improve, but they have actually seen those things get worse. cost of living, housing prices, gas prices on the rise again. Talks about interest rates going up because there's no way to be able to address the inflation that is inevitable being brought about by both tariffs and corporate greed. There's so many factors to consider here, and inevitably it's going to be portrayed as voter fraud by the Republican right. And I'm here to tell you right now, you're seeing the tea leaves with these state elections. 28 flips from November 24 until today, and that number is going to get higher. We have 2 calls. We're expecting Charles Franklin at 9:30, so we'll try and blow through a couple of these here as quickly as we can. Hello, you're on Outside the Box.
Good morning.
Morning.
Yes, I was just thinking about a cartoon that would be good. Would be Trump and Iranians standing in the room facing each other's wall, opposite walls, and saying, and Trump going blah blah blah. Here's my 15 points, and the Iranian guy facing the other wall going blah blah blah. Go, you American bastard, if you want to say that, go to hell. I think that would be a pretty comical cartoon, political cartoon.
Well, you should draw it then. Go. This is that era.
Sorry, I'm not a drawer.
That's
the
one.
I know. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Hey, I appreciate the call, but yeah, go ahead and draw it. But I think that's fair. I don't even know if these peace talks are happening. I'm going to be honest with you. If I were the Iranian government, I would recognize the position I'm in right now. Due to social media, I would see how angry the voting population is. I'd see how angry the even the MAGA voters are about being lied into yet another war in the Middle East. And I would understand the hand that I was dealt and the hand that I would be able to play. And I would probably continue playing that hand until I no longer could anymore. I think that's basic strategy if you're really thinking about it objectively and not putting the red, white, and blue hat on and looking at it from the perspective of Iranians are just people that were born in another place. They're not somehow dumber or less intelligent than we are. They're just food for thought, you know? Hello, you're on Outside the Box.
Yeah, good morning, Ben. It's Gary calling. Say, regarding the flock cameras, I just want to say we've also gone to miniaturization thanks to the CIA and other agencies. So there's cameras all over, mobile ones. The second thing is regarding the poll. You got Mr. Franklin coming on there. It seems to me that polls missed the mark in the last presidential election. And I just wonder what he's doing, how they do their poll, or what improvements they made since the last time they did the presidential one, because they missed by a little bit. And I know they do the plus or minus 4 or 5%, but they still missed. And I wonder, with people with cell phones and dropping landlines and time of day of the surveys, how do they actually do the mechanics on the survey? Because I remember people saying about on these smart TVs, they know what you're watching on TV and so forth, and you do Arbitron or something for radios. There's a lot of surveys done, but nobody ever calls me.
Sure.
And I just wondered, what improvements did Franklin make in his survey compared to the last time in terms of how they actually do the survey, whether they increase the count, whether they change the geographic area or the makeup or what? So
I like that. I'll bring it up with him when he comes on the show, but I think that's a fair question to ask. And like, realistically, everybody has different methods. I appreciate the call, Gary. I know in the Pittsburgh TV market, the dude I used to produce for hosted TV before he ended up on the radio. And he would tell me we could tell by the minute. He said we could see at 12:15 this many people stopped watching, and so we know whatever we were doing at 12:15 is not of interest to people. Meanwhile, in radio, I am going to find out about the spring ratings sometime in the middle of July. So I'm going to do my show the same way for the next 5 months. And then eventually I'm going to get a reading that says, hey, do you remember what you were doing from March to May? That either did or didn't work. So maybe change. And like, that's not necessarily as effective of a way to do things as the way they do it in TV. And polling kind of goes the same direction. Everybody has their own methods, everybody has their own means, everybody has their different amount of resources. And for the record, I don't even know in the Wisconsin market, in the Northeast Wisconsin market, is it the same as the Pittsburgh market, because it's a smaller market in terms of population size. So who the hell knows? But you bring up a valid point, and I will try, and I'll see if we can't get some insight to that with Charles. Karen says, and I just want to make sure, I'm going to have to keep checking the video feed here to make sure that Charles isn't standing by. Okay, so Karen says, Supreme Court is hearing a case in Mississippi regarding whether mail-in ballots postmarked before the election can be counted. Fun fact, Karen, that's what Arnold, Jerry, and I will be talking about during the professor segment today. So don't you worry, we have an in-depth conversation planned about that a little bit later on in the program during the 10 o'clock hour. So hopefully you can stay around for that. If not, download the WHBY app. David says, I believe 2 other reasons Democrat lost. The presidential election is a woman was on the ballot. She was black. Of course, no one say that. David, I disagree. I disagree with that wholeheartedly. I'm sure there's some people that feel that way, but I just don't buy into it by and large, personally. I see I have other text messages. My guest is waiting in the wings, though. So I'll tell you what, we have a very short break here. We're going to be back in 90 seconds. We're going to be chatting with Charles Franklin about the Marquette polling standards. We're going to be talking updates about the Supreme Court, Democratic gubernatorial race, Republican gubernatorial race, attitudes towards tariffs, the Iran war, overall political favorability, Trump's favorability, all of that's coming up. So stick around. We'll be back in just a little bit. You're listening to Outside the Box with Ben Cominos here on WHBY and Political Voices Network. All right, we're back. Ben Cominos, WHBY, Outside the Box, Political Voices Network. Been looking forward to this next conversation here. We do plenty of chatting about Marquette polling, about polling in general. While polling is not a guarantee of the way things are going to shape up, it definitely can provide you some insight into the way that things are trending. And that's going to be part of the question we have here with Charles Franklin with Marquette Polling. Charles, how are you today? Thank you for joining us. I know you're normally on Jonathan Krause's show, so welcome to the morning side of things here.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm glad we could do it today.
Yeah, yeah, I'm glad to as well. I've been putting this off for a while because I dive into this poll pretty regularly, but it's going to be interesting to get a little bit of extra insight here. I do have to ask before we get into. I had a caller, Gary, who asked this question. Before we get into the actual numbers, he asked what goes into your methods, I guess, a little bit here and how you improve, what makes them different. He says, I've never been asked to take part in a Marquette poll. So what does that look like?
Well, you never know. We might have called and he didn't pick up because folks don't pick up. And seriously, that is a big issue. It's the reason we've changed our methodology is because it became so hard to get people on the phone. What we do now is we sample from the registered voter list. So we know that everybody we're sampling is registered to vote. And then we send them an email or a text message or both with a link to complete the survey online. And about 80 to 90% complete the poll online. Those that we don't hear back from, we do phone. And so we still do between 10 and 20% on the phone. But now the vast majority are done online. And the main change that we've made aside from that is we now divide the state into 100 regions from the most Republican to the most Democratic. And we get the right proportion, about 1%, from each of those 100 regions in the state. And so that's something that we've changed in recent years to try to make sure that we're adequately representing everything from the most Republican to the most Democratic and the most purple, the most evenly divided parts of the state. So those are the big changes.
Okay, very interesting. I hope that answer satisfies you, Gary. I figured it was something along those lines there. I know I'm skeptical about those unknown numbers, and I can only imagine that's a hurdle to jump over here. But let's get into it. You'd be forgiven for forgetting, but we're 2 weeks away from an election here, and there's a little bit of a different atmosphere than there has been the last couple of Aprils, that's for sure. So let's start with the Wisconsin Supreme Court. It makes the most sense. You have some data here about the attitudes towards both both candidates. Go for it.
Yeah. And people have been slow to tune into this election compared to where they were a year ago in that Supreme Court election. In this poll in March, just 12% say they've heard a lot about the election. A year ago, it was 39% in February. And so we are not nearly as attentive to this race as we were to the one last year. Now, I hasten to add, over 50% say they've heard at least something about the race. So it's not like it's a complete blank, but we really haven't followed this race the way we did a year ago. That shows up in undecided voters. Here we're just 2 weeks out from the election, and 46% of likely voters say they still haven't made up their mind who to vote for. 30% support Chris Taylor, 22% support Maria Lazar. So Taylor has a lead there, 8 points this month. A month ago in February, with likely voters, it was a 7-point Taylor lead. So that's been fairly consistent. The other thing that really jumps out at you is that 77% of Democrats say they're absolutely certain they're going to vote in this race. Only 59% of Republicans say the same. So that's one of the things that's boosting Taylor and boosting Democrats generally, is a higher level of turnout in these April elections compared to what we saw in November of 2024 in a high turnout presidential race. It used to be that low turnout favored Republicans. Now low turnout in an April race favors Democrats.
Does the amount of undecided voters impact your ability to do margin of error? Like when you see an 8-point lead, that would be outside of most margins of error, but with such a large percentage of undecided, realistically, that's not as safe as it would be in a more concrete set of data.
No, that's right. For likely voters, the margin of error of this poll is 5.3 percentage points, which is less than the 8-point lead. But, we don't know what those 46% are going to do. Some of them will end up deciding not to vote, but some may make up their minds and they could tilt towards one candidate or the other. And that's just an unknown which way they might tilt. It could, if they're end up, I should say, a little bit more Republicans are undecided than Democrats. Not a lot, it's about 5% more. But if Republicans sort of came into the electorate, so they raised their turnout percentage, and if they make up their minds and go to Lazar, the way most Republicans who have decided are, then we could see this margin tighten. On the other hand, you look at that big Democratic turnout advantage, and there's certainly potential for the race to expand Taylor's lead. So that's an unsatisfactory way of saying there's a big margin for error here, not in the technical sense, but simply in the sense that late deciding voters could tip this race, and deciding to vote or not to vote is another unknown that could shift the outcome. The bottom line is, compared to most of our polls a week or two before the election, where the undecided rate might be 10%, there's a lot more uncertainty because of undecideds now.
That I figured as much. That definitely does make sense. Staying in the world of Wisconsin state politics, we have a gubernatorial race. We're wrapped up in the middle of a primary season right now. It's interesting because you have a similar data set here in terms of undecided there as well, but two very different setups in terms of the Democratic primary and the Republican Party. What did you end up finding here?
Yeah, and just as people haven't tuned into the Supreme Court race, they haven't tuned into that August primary, which granted is a lot further away than 2 weeks. It's not a surprise. We only see two candidates in the governor's race that have a name ID above 50%. A name ID is able to recognize the name and say whether you have a favorable or unfavorable view of that candidate. Congressman Tom Tiffany, 50% recognize his name. Democrat Mandela Barnes, it's just a little over 50% that recognize his name. Then it drops down to Lieutenant Governor Sarah Rodriguez, whose name ID is in the 30s. And then all of the other candidates are in the 20s or the teens. So again, voters simply aren't very tuned into this race. When we ask about vote choice in the primary, 54% are undecided in the Republican primary, where there's really only Tiffany and a much less known candidate, Andy Mansky. And in the Democratic primary, it's 63% undecided. Again, I don't think that's surprising when the race is so far off. But what you see, especially in the Democratic primary, is that nobody has a commanding lead. Francesca Hong is a little bit ahead at 14 points, Barnes at 11%, and then everybody else is 3 points or less. I should say Hong has been the slight leader in all three of our polls since October, but it's still, even now, at just 14%. There's not a commanding lead, but it is worth noting that she has come in first, even with a low overall percentage, but come in first in three polls in a row. So it's worth paying attention to that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at the very least, it shows an overall trend of where the electorate is, which I think is worth following along with. Switching gears here into, and we're speaking with Charles Franklin, we're breaking down Marquette polling right here. Some of the policies coming out of the Donald Trump White House right now have a specific impact on the people of Wisconsin. Obviously, agriculture being a very high-ranking issue with on a lot of people's minds. The tariffs. How are people viewing those almost a year since Liberation Day, or actually, I think just beyond a year since Liberation Day? What are the thoughts now?
Yeah, they're pretty negative about tariffs, and for farmers especially so. We asked, do you think the tariffs are helping or hurting Wisconsin farmers? 60% think they're hurting the farmers, just 16% think they're helping farmers. On the broader question, do tariffs help or hurt the U.S. economy? 53% say hurt, 30% say help, and 17% say they don't make much difference. And finally, we've just had a Supreme Court decision which struck down Trump's use of the tariffs under a particular law. 59% favored that court decision striking the tariffs down. 40% opposed that decision, there's a big partisan split there with Republicans in favor of tariffs and opposed to the Supreme Court decisions. But 3/4 of independents and over 90% of Democrats are pleased with that Supreme Court decision. So tariffs are not very popular. They've been unpopular since the beginning, I should say, on that question of do they help the economy. Between 50 and 55 and 60% have said they hurt the economy in every poll we've done since Trump started the second term.
And I might be going outside of your purview here, but do you have any data on people's attitudes towards tariffs if they had been administered in maybe a less carte blanche kind of way here, maybe a more targeted way? Is there any information on that?
No, we haven't asked those kinds of questions. I think the main thing that you see in other people's polling is a few more say that tariffs would help in the long run, even if they hurt in the short run. But we've not asked that question. I'm quoting other pollsters that have found that in national polling, not here in the state.
Sure. All right. So staying in the conversation about different policies here, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first Marquette poll since the war in Iran broke out. So we have a little bit of information there regarding people in Wisconsin's attitudes towards where this is headed.
And this poll was done completely after the beginning of the war on February 28th. So this is all clearly after the war started. 39% approve of the attacks on Iran, 61% oppose them. There's a hefty partisan split. 75% of Republicans approve, but 78% of independents, sorry, I missaid that. 71% of independents disapprove of the war, and 97% of Democrats disapprove. So big party split there.
Yeah, we're all shocked, I'm sure. And the last question I have for you here, but it's kind of like a two-parter here, is in regards to favorability, both in terms of the Trump administration's favorability, but also highlighting whether you're talking about Democrats, independents, GOP, or traditional conservative favorability. Where are all of those kind of trending? What numbers are you seeing?
Yeah, on Trump's approval, 42% approve, 56% disapprove. That's a net of minus 14, negative 14 points more disapprove than approve. That's an all-time low, whether it's in his first or his second term. The previous low in the first term was minus 12. This has started out in the second term at minus 3 and has worked its way down a couple of points with every poll we've done, and dropping 4 points on net approval this month. Surely that is connected to the Iran war, which is, as we just said, unpopular. And while we didn't ask about gas prices in this poll, I don't think it's much of a leap to think that the surge in gas prices since the Iran war began is also playing a role of dragging down Trump's approval rating. You won't be surprised that Republicans are still quite positive towards the president. 84% approve of the job he's doing. 66% of independents disapprove, and 98% of Democrats disapprove. So I think the number to watch there is independents, where it's just 26 approve, 66 disapprove. That's a net minus 40. Neither party in this state has a majority of voters. Independents aren't a huge share of the electorate, but they're vital that a party win over a good share of independents in order to win an election. So I think looking ahead to November, these numbers for the president among independents are pointing to a pretty challenging year for Republicans in the fall, unless the president can do some things to win independents back, at least some, because these are really lopsided numbers against him among independents.
Yeah, the independent number definitely does stick out to me. I just, for frame of reference, I looked up Joe Biden's approval during the entire 4 years, and it does seem like outside of the first Marquette poll when he became president, he was
Yeah.
closer to 50-50. Outside of that, it does seem like it was kind of in this 41 to 46 range here where Donald Trump finds himself. The independent number might have been a little different, but that we're not in uncharted territory in that
And,
regard.
and in some ways, for the same reason, Joe Biden really suffered because people's number one concern was inflation and the cost of living. And that hurt him, and then it hurt Kamala Harris in the fall and helped Donald Trump in 2024. But now people are still most concerned about the cost of living, but it's Donald Trump's problem now instead of the Democrats' problem. And that is one of the things that's pulling down Trump. Now we've added the war and the consequences of the war, but economic issues are the top of the agenda for voters in our polls really since 2022, and that hasn't gone away.
Yeah, anyone who's going to the grocery store paying rent is reminded of that every day. We're speaking with Charles Franklin with Marquette Polling. This was the inaugural Outside the Box visit. I appreciate you coming on here and taking part in this little video experiment that I'm still kind of working out here. Thank you very much for your time and information.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Of course. You take it easy. I don't know how to talk to you after this, so I'm going to let you go, but I'll be in touch. You take it easy.
Very good.
Good stuff there. Always appreciate a good conversation, helping me break down and parse through some of this information. We're going to squeeze one more quick break in here, and we'll kind of jump into those numbers, and I'll take any comments. I see we've got some texts. The chat on the YouTube channel has been popping off quite a bit as well. And we'll kind of break that down before the professors get in here for their 10 o'clock segment. Moving a mile a minute, we're going to keep it rolling. You're listening to Outside the Box with Ben Cominos here on WHBY and Political Voices Network. Definitely some interesting insight coming from Charles Franklin there with Marquette Polling. I uh I appreciate him joining us on the program and just kind of running down some of these numbers because, as I've mentioned, none of what we're talking about there is a guarantee. I think we're a long way away. I can even tell you from the Democratic side, I'm already anticipating it because Francesca Hong is probably the more progressive candidate out there. And I've watched what happens anytime a progressive candidate tends to kind of stand out from a pack with a bunch of more centrist, moderate Democrats. I know what the next step is to come from the Democratic Party. I saw it in the 2020 election, and I am anticipating it happening again. I think, moreover, the Republican conversation is much more interesting because there's still time to run, and it seems by and large that a large percentage of that party is just not necessarily sold on what Tom Tiffany is or what he represents. Maybe times change that, and I can tell you full-throatedly that I think the closer you get to election time, the more people that are maybe being a little stubborn. It really is a test of principles as you get closer. As I oftentimes pound my chest about, I was able to, I harangued the Democratic Party, who I agree with their style of politics more than Republicans, during an election year. It takes guts to do it during an election year. And so whether or not the people who seem a little unsold on Tom Tiffany end up doing the right thing or not, only time will tell. But we'll have to see what happens. But it is interesting insight, nevertheless, that I think is worth looking into and getting excited about here. It's going to be the last set of polling data that we get before the race for Wisconsin Supreme Court, which, by the way, I probably should have said this before now. Early voting has started. It started yesterday. So I am very much a get there on the day of and do the voting kind of thing. I'm an old soul that way. No, mail in voting is not corrupt. Absentee voting is not corrupt. Early voting is not corrupt. I just choose to do it that way because it's the way that I like to do it. And I work one of those jobs where I sort of can just come and go as I please. Like 8:30 to 11, I'm kind of beholden to being in one specific place. But outside of those specific hours in the day, I can kind of just do whatever I want whenever I want. So I just go day of. I'm fortunate to be in that position. Everyone should do what they think is right. But if you are not a day of voter, you have the capacity to vote in that election right now. And I do see people in my YouTube chat line going back and forth here a little bit. Someone was saying, where did it go? Republicans would vote for insert historical tyrant here if you put an R next to their name. I feel I'm of two minds about that. And I only have a minute and 30 seconds to get into it here. But to a certain extent, before the Trump, like the second Trump term, I would have believed, I would say that's nonsense. Stop talking about an entire political movement that way. Where I get frustrated, where I am most heartbroken, where I am the most disappointed by what MAGA represents is the complete 180 on pointless wars about regime change taking place overseas with the use of American tax dollars, and the fact that 90% of self-identified MAGA voters have thrown their lot in with that idea when they said they were voting specifically about not being in favor of that. You heard Charles Franklin kind of break the numbers down there, and that to me is what kind of highlights that there is an element of groupthink there. But if you expect me to pretend for a single second that the fascism that the Biden administration was allowing Israel to enact in Gaza should be going unaddressed in that conversation, well, you got another thing coming, that's for sure. We've got to go. The professors are coming. I got to help them set up their video thing here, so we will be back in just a little bit. If you can't check it out, hop on the YouTube channel, or you can check us out on the WHBY app. I have my own YouTube channel at Ben Cominos, or you can go to Political Voices Network. We'll be back with Arnold and Jerry on the other side of the break. Outside the Box, WHBY. All right, and we're back to Outside the Box with Ben Cominos right here on WHBY and Political Voices Network. Outside the Box is brought to you by Roush Plumbing and Remodeling, the plumbing and remodeling company the Fox Valley depends on. If you are just joining us, we had a conversation briefly about flock cameras and then pivoted to chatting with Charles Franklin with Marquette Polling about the Marquette polling data that came out here today. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions still up there. And what's crazy is we're less than 2 weeks away from an election here that we're probably going to be discussing at least briefly during the conversation now, as I'm joined by two more guests. It's one of those kind of shows here today. Over the phone, still in Berkeley, still in California, now in San Francisco, but not as a result of the nonsense at the airports. Jerry Poder, how are you? Coming over the phone here. How are you, Jerry?
Good. Refusing to come home.
Yeah, that's what it is. I was nervous when you told me you were still there. I'm like, oh no, is it going to be one of those you're stuck there for 3 days kind of moments? But glad to see that it was by choice.
If you're going to be stuck anywhere,
Yeah.
you might as well be stuck in Berkeley in the Bay Area.
Yeah, I hear that. And then coming to you live from the polar opposite side of the Woodward Community Ranch, Arnold Schober, also available on the YouTube stream here as well. Arnold, how are you this fine Wednesday morning?
Doing great. I noticed that you put me in a room without a window, unlike yours. So at least I can't daydream here.
Hey, I don't have control over the aesthetics. All right, I don't know if you know me, Arnold, but I'm not a particularly aesthetic guy. I'll tell you what. I was telling Jerry over the phone there, Arnold. I was actually getting comments before you guys got in. They were not knowing about what we were getting into, but people said all of their eyes are focused right now on the United States Supreme Court and the mail-in ballot case that is definitely worth jumping into here between the three of us. For those of you guys unaware, Donald Trump did commit voter fraud during the his own Senate district vote yesterday, voting by mail, which I was told is not trustworthy and absolutely should not be available to American citizens here. And depending on what's going on in the Supreme Court, we might have a different outlook here. So, Arnold, I want to start with you. Big time Supreme Court case coming up here. What are people expecting to learn, and what are we trying to find out here?
So with the mail-in ballots, the Supreme Court heard arguments about whether they could be received and counted after Election Day. So the state of Mississippi and 24 other states, 18 states, I think, have provisions for mail-in ballots to come in after Election Day in a certain window, and then them to add to the total. The Supreme Court, based on questions, and of course that's not determinative, but based on questions some of the justices asked, sounded like they would say that in fact ballots have to be received by Election Day, period. So anything that comes in after Election Day would not count. So that would in fact cause changes to a number of large states, including Jerry's temporary home here in California, which counts ballots that come in long after Election Day. And so I think Trump has spun this as a kind of a win that it would be a win for Republicans. That's not really that clear, but it would definitely change election administration in a sizable chunk of the country.
Jerry, your thoughts on the matter? Okay, go ahead.
I think the reason that this case was brought in the first place, and what's haunting Republicans, is that in 2020, thanks to a Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruling on ballots received after Election Day, Republicans would argue, and the Republican National Committee is arguing, that Joe Biden won Pennsylvania in 2020 largely because of these late received mail-in ballots. And for whatever reason, and it may just be a cultural tick or a cultural political tick, Republicans believe that mail-in ballots do not favor them. They favor the Democrats, and certainly coming in after Election Day. And that's really what the Supreme Court seemed to be worried about, the whole idea of election integrity. In other words, the idea that a result could change 5 days after the election even if these votes were completely valid, it gives the appearance of impropriety. And I think that's what the Supreme Court justices, at least the conservative ones, were worried about at argument.
Yeah, so if you look at federal election finance law, that's the same concern that the court allows kind of campaign finance restrictions under. It's like, is there going to be an appearance of impropriety? Not that anyone's doing anything wrong or amiss, but if it looks like they could be, the justices historically have been amenable to placing certain restrictions in and around elections and campaigning. And that Brett Kavanaugh in particular used that line in his questions, like, it looks fishy even if it isn't, right? And quite frankly, mail-in ballots are a convenience. There's no constitutional right to a mail-in ballot versus kind of a polling place, as long as there's some way for you to vote. And so on one hand, this is purely a mechanical kind of administration issue. But I do agree with Jerry that the reason we get this case is because of that Pennsylvania situation in 2020 where it looked fishy. Even if everyone had cast ballots correctly, it looked fishy. And I think that Kavanaugh and others say this is a pretty straightforward way to avoid at least that problem, at least that appearance problem.
Yeah, I completely understand that. Out of curiosity, do or have either of you guys voted via mail? Or because I was just telling a story about it in the 9 o'clock hour. I have all these options, and early voting is happening right now. You could go cast your vote for the Wisconsin Supreme Court today. I will be there on Tuesday, April 7th to do it in person. It's just how I am. Do you guys use these alternate methods here, or do you kind of old school with it?
So for me,
Go ahead, Arnold.
Okay. For me, I have for many years believed that going to the polls is like one of the last civic things that everybody does. But since few people do that anymore because of mail-in ballots, I am reconsidering whether it's worth my effort to go down and say, "Hi, Professor Schober. It's good to see you again." 2 years after the last one.
I like that part. What about yourself, Jerry?
I'm very old school in virtually everything I do because I'm old. In 2020, I voted by mail, I think for obvious reasons.
Sure.
No one could come out of the house. But otherwise, I am at the polling place virtually every chance I get, even when nobody else seems to know that there's an election going on. So weather permitting, I plan to be at the polls on April 7th. That is if I ever get back from California.
Yeah. Well, conventional wisdom says because they would tell you the reason mail-in voting exists is specifically for your demographic, Jerry. They tell you the older you get, the less likely you are. I even had who was it in my text line here? John. My mom has been using mail-in voting for 30 years because she worked the polls for 20 years and now because of her age. Why do these nut jobs want a 92-year-old to stand in line for hours? So like that's kind of the added, at least the conventional wisdom surrounding why this is. But you're obviously bucking the trends. That's why you're on outside the box, I suppose.
Well, that's true. I'm always thinking of my late father who insisted on voting in person back in those days. Even if he could barely walk, he would crawl to the polls to be able to cast his ballot. And I think that was sort of generational on his part as well.
Yeah, I feel that. Arnold, I'll aim this question at you. Karen asked in the chat line, am I wrong in thinking that only Congress can change a state's voting procedures? Do you have any insight into whether or not Karen is accurate at that assessment or not? Because it seems as though this is pretty cut and dry here in terms of the Supreme Court. But just to be clear.
The Supreme Court, so this is checks and balances, right? So Congress can change the law up to a certain point because the Constitution does have a carve out in Article 1 that state legislatures have a role in this for setting the manner of elections. However, anything that Congress does can be reviewed by the Supreme Court. And particularly if it impinges on things in the Constitution, which elections are in the Constitution for federal offices. And so in this case, the court is clearly within its purview to hear the case and to render a decision that would be binding on Mississippi and any other state that allowed. Mississippi brought the case or is arguing the case. Any other state that allows ballots to come in after Election Day.
Thank you for going off the cuff there. Oh, go ahead, Jerry. Do you have something to add?
Yeah, Congress established something called Election Day. There is an election day. And I think that's what's complicating all of this. Is a mail-in vote, especially received after election day, considered to be an election day ballot? Or is an early vote considered to be cast on election day? And some of the justices, and usually Clarence Thomas is the one who pushes the envelope, he raised the point of, is early voting legal? Because it's not necessarily on election day.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm sure you guys as professors also both understand it's such a Ben move to get to mail in the ballot after election day. No, this still counts technically. It was on the deadline. Jaromani in the YouTube chat line says, I voted by mail, drop off clerk since COVID. This election I'll be in person because it's your child's first time. Love that. And Larry says he mailed in a vote once. I worried that the vote would end up in the garbage. I get it. I'm an old soul that way as well. Before we change gears here, Jerry, I want to aim this at you, but Arnold, I'm going to get your thoughts on it as well, because this is the last time. It's kind of ironic that the next time we chat, we will have a new Wisconsin Supreme Court justice, and this may be the first time that we're talking about it here. Jerry, you and I were kind of speculating off the air about why it's kind of been much quieter. I just spoke with Charles Franklin at Marquette Polling. As it stands right now, Chris Taylor has 30%, Maria Lazar's at 22%. That leaves about half the electorate still undecided about where they're going with it here. Very different vibe surrounding the Wisconsin Supreme Court as we are in the middle of an early voting season right now. Jerry, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the quietude here, or the relative quietude, is a result of this election not changing the ideological composition of the court. The last time around, the ideological composition was on the line, but not this time. So a little earlier, Ben, the national Republican groups, or the national Republican-oriented groups, may be holding their fire here, or holding their money and attention for the governor's race later this year, which they consider to be more important.
Arnold, any follow-up there?
I think too, and maybe this is me being optimistic, perhaps, but the last two go-rounds at the Wisconsin Supreme Court have been very exhausting, in the sense that they're kind of been very high profile, lots of partisan involvement. There's some of that this time, but nowhere near, as you noted, like in the past. So I think there's some exhaustion. Jerry's right that the direction of the court is not really at stake in this election. Obviously, conservatives would like one of the candidates, and liberals or progressives would like another, but it's not like there's going to be a substantial change on the court this case, which is probably better if we're going to have to elect judges, which you can tell I'm not a great fan of. But if we're going to have to do them, I would prefer that they not be quite so partisanly tinged as they have been in the past. And perhaps there's been a little bit of exhaustion with that here in Wisconsin. The second point, Democrats are feeling better this time, right? Not only is the direction of the court not really at stake, but it's not like Donald Trump is polling at 65 or 90% or something, where they'd have to be worried in the same kind of way as if the political environment was different.
Sure. Well, it will be interesting. I'm sure that will make up probably the bulk of our conversation in 2 weeks here. Although, what do I know at the pace that news breaks anymore here? I'll tell you guys what, we're going to have to squeeze a quick break in here. I'm going to take that break to insult Jerry and Arnold nonstop, and then see if they still want to help me on the other side of that, talk about NATO and whether or not they're going to help us during this whole Iran conversation. That's Arnold Schover, Jerry Poder out in California. I'm Ben Cominos. You're listening to Outside the Box on WHBY and Political Voices Network. Listen, Wisconsin, we're not warm yet, but melting days and freezing nights mean water is on the move and your sump pump is about to get busy. Water damage is one of the top reasons homeowners file insurance claims, so do yourself a favor and just avoid the headache altogether. Test your sump pump today. Call or text Tim Roush. Just use that free text line that I've been telling you guys about. They can help keep your basement dry and protected. Head to timroushplumbing.com for that text line and more info. That's Roush Plumbing, the plumbing and remodeling company the Fox Valley depends on. It's a Professor's Wednesday. We're here chatting with Arnold Schober, Jerry Podair. Just wrapped up a conversation about mail-in balloting, a court case being decided by the United States Supreme Court, determining whether or not we're going to be able to count ballots after Election Day, which obviously leads to some hang-ups in terms of vote tabulations. And as Arnold so colloquially put it, finding out about the elections before the next lunar month in some states' cases, specifically where Jerry's located right now in the state of California. They're a bit outdated in their counting measures now.
Well, I find it ironic that the most technologically advanced state in the union, California, the state that gave us the internet, that gave us Silicon Valley, can't count their ballots until 6 to 7 weeks sometime after Election Day.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely unbelievable. Like, I understand the population is larger. I understand you probably need some rules. I know we deal with that here in Wisconsin, that you should be able to kind of deal with the ballots a little bit beforehand to expedite the process. But there's no amount of, if just me went and we're tabulating votes, I feel like it would be done faster. So I absolutely feel you're right there. That's for sure. Let's see. We got one other person commenting here. I will be out of town on Election Day, so voted in person, absentee. Yesterday, my village clerk was my witness. The ballot is sealed in an envelope and not opened by mail until Election Day. Glad not to have to worry about the postmarks or any other post office issues. That sounds like voter fraud in my book, but thank you for sharing. All right, let's get into the international scene here. And it's kind of an existential question at that, which is absolutely my cup of tea. So let's kind of jump into it. NATO has been an alliance for about 70 years at this point. That's been pretty dependable from an American standpoint. It's a matter of can you put it back in the box once something has been broken like this? And I have quite a few thoughts about this, but let's just kind of start with the generic angle of it. And Jerry, we'll start this conversation with you here regarding NATO showing a pretty heavy reluctance to actually get involved with addressing the Strait of Hormuz issue. Now, there's a number of factors that could be considered into why that is, whether it is Donald Trump's threats against Greenland, whether it is the danger that exists in general with trying to address the Strait of Hormuz. What are your thoughts there? And is there a way to, I'm trying to think of a way to, can you put this genie back in the bottle once you kind of cross this line here of not necessarily coming to an ally's aid when asked about it?
Right. You know, the reason I suggested that we talk about this is when I read, especially initially, the United Kingdom saying after Trump asked the UK and other NATO nations to help out on opening up the Strait of Hormuz, this is not our war. My first, which was their initial response, my initial response is, you know, NATO is so over. That was my first. That was my first response, and I thought, well, we should probably talk about this because that really is a line in the sand, not just for Trump, who obviously has built part of his political career on hostility to NATO or the continuance of the alliance, constantly saying, well, what does the U.S. get out of it? But at this point, I think it is become part of our political culture to question NATO. So I think the end of NATO as we know it, I think, is very close at hand. Even though the NATO nations have sort of backtracked from that original refusal to get involved in the Strait of Hormuz at all, you know, we see that the UK is helping out with minesweeping. There's now sort of a pledge that a number of NATO nations have signed saying they will help out in opening up the Strait of Hormuz. But my sense is that this is the last legs, basically, of NATO, especially from the United States perspective.
Arnold, let me phrase it to you a different way here. Obviously, there's a bit of frustration, specifically coming from the Trump White House right now, that they're not coming to bat for us. We know the defense spending numbers. America, while we are lacking in some ways, we are not lacking in defense spending. We have done our part economically, at least militarily, to keep the countries of NATO safe. Is there an element of maybe this is a little bit more bluster, maybe to just play devil's advocate to what Jerry said right there? I'm not saying anything Jerry said was wrong, but just to play devil's advocate here, is there an element of, look, there could be a time when we need America's resources, and we definitely want to be able to say we showed up? Like, is there a way to get back to what this is, or has Trump's attitude and statements kind of shown that we're only one election away from another 4 years of a president similar in mindset to what Donald Trump is? And is that always in the back of people's minds, or what do you think wins the day here?
Well, I think for Europe, this is a bigger question than for the U.S. Like you pointed out, Ben, the U.S. is not really lacking for military spending, and that Trump largely did this, well, with good Israeli help, but largely did it unilaterally. And so I think Europe has to think more carefully about this because they still have to worry about Russia in a way that the U.S. doesn't really have to worry about. That's the reason for NATO was the USSR, and Russia, however weakened it might be because of the conflict in Ukraine, is still breathing down the necks of Lithuania, Poland, okay, all those former Eastern Bloc countries in a way that threatens Europe. Secondly, right, the U.S. is largely energy independent, right? We don't need Iranian oil in this country, and we can't, right, get it legally anyway. We pump lots of it ourselves now, but Europe needs that oil, and so they do need some kind of defense from the U.S. And so I do wonder if they are thinking that, fine, Trump insults us and insults NATO regularly. That's part of his shtick, but we do need to put in our effort because we are going to need the U.S. when Russia lobs a few missiles into Poland by, quote, accident at some point, and to see if Europe does anything, because in that case, they will need the Americans. And if someone, say Trump, said, look, you didn't help me with this oil problem, we're in trouble.
And you know, from our standpoint, from the standpoint of the Americans, we probably our listeners know that we email back and forth before our show begins. I use the term the Groyper right to describe a section of the Republican Party, which may be more politely known as conservative nationalists. And they, I think, are the future of the Republican Party. And that part of the Republican Party doesn't seem to believe in allies, or doesn't seem to believe in the efficacy of allies. And that may be the future of the United States, basically. NATO might be the first casualty of the Groyper right or the conservative nationalist right if they attain power. And their spokesperson clearly is J.D. Vance. But other international or multilateral institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the World Trade Organization, they may be casualties of this we don't need any allies, conservative nationalist right. And that's what I see on the horizon in this country.
Yeah, I have to admit, I laughed out loud when I saw you use the word Groyper in an email. I was like, well, if Jerry's using it, that means the word's dead. But I'm glad that it has, it's made it into the vernacular there. And I do think you have an assessment there. And just let me throw this out there because you bring up an interesting point. A lot of the quote unquote Groyper movement is kind of stemmed from the fact that, Jerry, you're from an era where you kind of saw America's systems, I think, work in a more beneficial way for Americans, whereas a lot of people, especially the ones younger than me, under 30, really see these as kind of one-way relationships, even if that might not be the case in terms of perception, in terms of the overall outcome when they're struggling to get by. But I think you're probably onto something there, that you're probably going to see some of these longer standing alliances and groupings dismantle, and in all likelihood, new alliances and new groupings kind of take their place, which kind of leads into the last part of this conversation here in terms of like long and short-term consequences. So I'm going to bring Arnold into his favorite thing to do in the world, prognosticate here. Were this relationship with NATO to go the way of the dodo, what path forward is there? Because I don't see a path forward without alliances, without partnerships, without working together with other nations, specifically nations that have similar agendas and similar desired outcomes here. I find it hard to believe, even with a right-wing movement and to a certain extent a left-wing movement frustrated with NATO, I find it hard to believe that that would entirely go away, just given how connected we all are at this point.
Well, something to remember is that NATO and many of the current multilateral institutions were designed in the wake of World War II, when there was a common kind of a sense that we can't do this again, and Europe is like totally defeated. It's both sides, like kind of a wasteland almost at the time. And so the institutions were there to say, here's something new. To some extent, that world is gone. And if these institutions collapse now, it's largely because there's nothing really holding them together. There's no common threat. There's not a kind of a destroyed Europe. And Europe isn't as important to world politics as it was in 1946 or 1949, more accurately here. And so new institutions, and people in the so-called global South are quick to point this out, new institutions would in fact have to rise that would account for a larger swath of the globe. I mean, what does Ethiopia think about all of this, right? Or Eritrea, which is also in the neighborhood of Iran. Okay, so what's going on here? So I think if we saw NATO disappear, partly because there's not that much motivation for it to hold it together, but we would see something else. But I think it would include a different look. It would not be the UN. It'd probably be more regional based organizations that had a stronger, perhaps local economic tie than NATO or others like that have.
Any additional? Go for it, Jerry.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what the conservative nationalist right is arguing is that America should always follow its interests. This is not America is not a charity. It always follows its interest and should follow its interest in terms of international relations. The problem with I think the conservative nationalist position, is that they don't seem to think that America needs allies at all, basically, that it can always act unilaterally when it wants to act and then retreat back into its shell or whatever we want to call it. And the idea that America does not require allies all over the world, I think, is very, very short-sighted. And I think that's part of this anti-NATO, anti-WTO, anti-IMF perspective on both the right and the left, but we're seeing it, I think, much more publicly on the right these days. And I think it's very short-sighted.
At least because U.S. military power is very hard to project if you don't have local bases. The
Sure.
Navy can do a lot, but it can't do everything. And there's also this problem of having to fly over other countries. And so, right, the U.S. military needs allies, if nothing else, to have to project military power, because not everyone's right off of the Gulf, off the Persian Gulf.
And they forget that. You know, they forget that these allies can really come in handy, and we have to keep them as allies. You know, one of the arguments that Lyndon Johnson was constantly making in support of the Vietnam War, and, you know, you could agree or disagree with this, is we owe it to our allies to stand in or hang in there on Vietnam. Because if we withdraw from Vietnam, we will tell all our other allies that we will not be there for them, and that's why we have to support Vietnam and continue the war in Vietnam. Now, you could agree or disagree with that, but he was making the point that allyship is a two-way street, and we do get something out of it. And I think that, again, not to bash conservative nationalism, but one of the things they miss is that we get things from allies. This is not a one-way street.
Yeah, you know, I find the older I get, the more I understand why there's a cyclical nature to history. You can equate what you're describing right now, Jerry, to the anti-vax movement. It's like polio shows up, vaccines get rid of it. Everybody's so excited that vaccines exist. Enough time goes by that we forget that there was ever a polio, and then the people become anti-vaxxers. You could say the same thing about tax cuts and tariffs, and then what that ultimately leads to. It's almost like it's a roundabout way, and there's a chance what you just described right there may end up taking place in a foreign policy standpoint as well. Before we switch gears here and get into the Cesar Chavez conversation to wrap up the show here today, I do have to ask, and I'll probably make this a recurring thing just because we do not know how long this conflict is going to go in Iran. For all we know, by the next time we chat in 2 weeks, it's over. There's absolutely no way to believe or trust anything coming from anywhere all the time. But I have to ask, because we had the conversation last week, do you see, and I'll start with you again, Jerry, on this, because you were kind of a little more Pollyannish on this one. You said if agendas were met, if this were a quick in and out and there was a better regime in there, that there might actually be a change in the political discourse. People might actually be viewing it favorably. We haven't gotten there yet. Do you still see a path towards that, or are we teetering on that point of no return where people are just kind of fed up with the forever war element of government?
Yeah, I said give it a month, and we're on March 25th, and this is obviously not going to be over on March 31st. I think what Trump may be thinking about is that famous line, declare victory and leave. At the height of the Vietnam War, a Republican senator, George Aiken of Vermont, suggested that we just declare victory in Vietnam and leave. And I think there is an element of that seems to be possibly on the horizon. If that's the case, and there are no long-term boots on the ground, and the government of Iran does not fall, but is still so disorganized and weakened that, at least for a number of years, it poses no significant threat, well, then I think there might be a change in American public opinion, or a shift in American public opinion, viewing this as a success.
Arnold, same question.
So I think that the short-term game is that Trump only has a few more weeks, I think, before he has to go to Congress and actually ask permission to do this. So
Yes,
that's his
war
first
powers,
deadline.
yeah.
Yeah, the War Powers Act, unless he wants to go to court over that, because we don't know if it's constitutional. Which, right, he might. He goes
Yeah.
to court over a lot of things. But I think that there is some opportunity for Trump to say, I'm going around and mopping up, right? I've quote fixed Venezuela. Cuba is next on the list. I mean, no electricity, right? It's going to come begging, and we're going to go in and fix that. I'm fixed Iran, which you might not see today, but you might see in 3 years, right? Okay, look, Iran is like Saudi Arabia has like stepped up and made Iran not a big deal anymore. Maybe Trump could spin this as a success because he went in with somewhat unclear motives from the U.S. perspective. Certainly from the Israeli perspective, there's strong reasons to kind of get rid of Iran. But from the U.S., it's a little bit more difficult to see that. And it's not been very clearly communicated. But I think that he's going to have to say, in retrospect, I've gotten rid of the bad boy on the block. But you're going to have to wait. Now, whether Trump has the discipline to wait around for that, I don't know. But I think that's how he could spin it as a success. He's helped that gas prices here haven't skyrocketed, right? They're higher than they were, but they're not noticeably crazy versus over the last 5 years. If that were to change, well, then all bets are off.
Did I just hear you say if Trump can show self-control, something will happen, but you don't know?
Now, Ben.
All right, just
This isn't
checking.
a betting show.
I heard what I heard. All right, should be interesting. I'm sure it won't be the last time that we talk about it there. We do have to put a pin in that conversation, though, and we're going to spend the last 8-ish minutes or so on a pretty interesting conversation here surrounding Cesar Chavez. His birthday coming up in just a couple of days here. Pretty celebrated individual in some circles, pretty vilified in others. We're going to kind of discuss a little bit about what he is and what he means to the political movement, maybe make some modern day comparisons as well, and talk about the idea of what's the word I'm looking for here, deifying elected officials in general here, which seems to have been becoming a problem more and more, especially in the era of the internet. That's Jerry Podair, Arnold Schober. I'm Ben Cominos. You're listening to Outside the Box on WHBY and Political Voices Network. All right, we've returned. We only have a couple minutes left, so we're going to jump right into it. Before I do that, though, I do want to remind everybody listening that WHBY and Cara Patrol are presenting Women Who Wow Us. We're celebrating locally nominated women during Focus Fox Valley with Haley Tenpes in the month of August, leading to Women's Equality Day on August 26th. You can nominate a woman who wows you now at WHBY.com. And of course, we also do have the CBS Tax Tips weekdays at 6:20 a.m. as well as 12:20 and 4:20 p.m. on WHBY. Those are brought to you locally by Haling and Associates in Neenah, an accounting firm dedicated to close personal attention, advanced trainings, and state-of-the-art tech. That's halingandassociates.com. On to the matter at hand here. Cesar Chavez's birthday is coming up here, and you set it up in a pretty interesting way here, Jerry. And seeing as you are the history professor in the group, I'm going to allow you to kind of inform the people who maybe not be as up to date on who we're talking about here. Provide a brief history, and Arnold, I will leave the door open for you to make any other comments that you might think are necessary to add beyond what Jerry says. Without further ado, Jerry, take it away.
Well, Cesar Chavez is, or at least was, one of the most iconic labor and civil rights leaders in American history. And it struck me that he is probably the most named American of the 20th century. And what I mean by that is streets, schools, roads, all sorts of institutions named after him. Only Martin Luther King Jr. and possibly JFK have more streets or institutions named after him than Cesar Chavez, who was the founder and leader of the United Farm Workers movement in the 1960s and 1970s, the struggle to unionize farm workers who were extremely exploited during that time and for many, many years. He organized that. He led a famous boycott of table grapes in the United States and nationally in support of that movement. He at least initially was successful in the 70s and 80s, organizing the farm workers. His union has certainly slipped in popularity. He died in 1993, has slipped in membership, but at least for those 15 or 20 years in the 70s and 80s, he was the iconic Latino civil rights leader and labor leader in the country. But now all of that is falling apart due to the allegations of sexual abuse, which have been at this point confirmed.
Yeah, it's the more these names appear on the list, I think there's a number of people impacted by that. And Arnold, I realize I just said I'd let you. Did you have anything else you wanted to add? I apologize.
No, that's good here.
Okay, cool. But yeah, I think you're exactly right there, Jerry. And I think it highlights a grander point here surrounding the deifying, the lionizing, the idolization, whatever word you want to use here. And Arnold, I'll tee you up here with this one since Jerry had the last one here. I was of the impression, because I was part of the my first election was the first Obama year, the first presidential election that I could vote in. And I remember the feelings of optimism, the feelings of, oh, life's going to be totally different now than what it was, and things fundamentally staying the same. And I thought that was going to be the wake-up call that kind of provided, like, these people are still just people. There's only so much that you can expect to get done. And then when one of these accusations comes about, like what we're dealing with Cesar Chavez, it's kind of hard for people to disassociate their feelings they had towards this public official versus what they actually did. And then that kind of lends itself to the cult following that we described today. I have to believe this isn't new in politics, but it feels like it might be a little more exacerbated just because of how connected we all are. And I guess just your thoughts on the growing trend of whether you're talking about Bernie Sanders or, as people colloquially call themselves, the K-Hive surrounding Kamala Harris. Obviously, MAGA is on the forefront of a lot of people's minds. Is this just the way forward? And is this Epstein stuff maybe going to be a wake-up call for a lot of us?
So I think one of the difficulties is that politicians have always been caught, and I think Cesar Chavez was a politician, right? He's a labor leader seeking change. They get put on pedestals because they're effective at what they do in a particular area. And I think that what's happened is that people conflate that with, oh, they're really a really effective labor organizer. They're a really effective kind of inspiring politician or what have you. And then they find out that there's other parts, and therefore they're 100% great, right? This is someone I want my kids to grow up to. And then you find out, oh, we're also doing these other things. And it's like, that's not so great. And so that conflation, I think, sets a lot of people up for kind of disappointment. It's not the first time this has happened. There have other politicians, when things come out like this is a career ender. Although I would point out that Donald Trump clearly has been able to survive this kind of
That
thing.
was
So
my thought.
some of it is in the eye of the beholder. And I think it's hard to do. But I'd point out it depends what values you infuse that person with. In our kind of exchange before the show, I pointed out that Robert E. Lee, right, the Confederate general, right, took 150 years to get him off his horse, right? When we had all of those kind of statuary debates, defacements, kind of removals, he was glorified by a segment of the U.S. population for a very long time for a certain number of reasons. And they would have told you it had nothing to do with slavery. Okay. Others said, well, there's other parts of this that don't seem to like square with what we think American values are. And so we had that kind of discussion in this country. I think with these more contemporary people where the internet is here with us and there's much less a buffer, the opportunity for people to be shown as imperfect, even perhaps sinful people is much easier to see. And so I think having politicians being put on pedestals is difficult. So California is moving to rename Cesar Chavez's birthday as Farm Workers Day. That's going to be a little bit easier. It's going to be harder to get upset about that because things aren't going to come out. But I think people are not perfect. And I think that poses problems, right, when we try to idolize them.
Yeah.
Well,
very quickly, Jerry.
Our heroes are now celebrities. Our political heroes, our labor heroes, our racial heroes are all celebrities. And they are subject to the law of celebrity, which is the higher they rise, the farther they fall often. And that is what's happening to Cesar Chavez. And especially since his activism was also infused with religion.
Absolutely. Jerry, I'm sorry I have to cut you off there. We are up against it. That's Jerry Podair, Arnold Schober, professors from Lawrence University. I have to get out of here. Haley's up next. Check the show out on YouTube if you missed any of it and download the app. Talk to you tomorrow.